Thanks for joining us for this Superversive SF Roundtable. On this episode, we have a few new faces. I'll start from the right. Well, it's me, your host, Jason. I'm back as usual. We have Tom Simon joining us, author and essayist extraordinaire. Oh, can people hear that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the...
Sorry, that's good. That's me. Sorry, it was echoing around. Yes, thanks for joining us, Tom.
Thank you for having me and for the effusive flattery.
We have author Marina Fontaine, who we have some exciting news about shortly. John C. Wright is back as usual. Judgy's on the way. We have Declan Finn, author of the Honour at Stake series, joining us, and host of the Catholic Geek podcast. That's right, isn't it?
Correct.
Excellent. David Halquist is back joining us as usual. And we have April Freeman, a new contributor to Superversive SF and author and very young person.
Dancing girl. I'm the dancing girl from the Victory video.
Yes, that's true. The dancing girl from the Victory video. Anyway. So, first up, some exciting news for Superversive SF. We are in the process of building Superversive Press, and we have our first release from author Marina Fontaine, a dystopian novel called dystopian novella called The Product, which you can pick up for Kindle and paperback via Amazon. Marina, do you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, hi. Okay, it is indeed a dystopian novella. It's what I call, it's somewhat of a high concept novella because it's built around obviously the product, and you don't find out what it is until very late in the story. It is dystopian. It's slightly different from my previous book in that it's a little bit of a throwback, I would say, to the traditional dystopian stories, and it just explores living in a dystopian society, but it's more character-oriented than it is world-oriented, but I do show a little bit of the way the world works along the way.
Okay. And I thought it was a great read. Well, that's why we agreed to publish it. So, you know,
right.
we don't hate it. And it would probably be actually, you're a relatively conservative yourself, I gather, from just talking to you and following you on Facebook and things like that. And the fact that you sort of head up the Conservative and Libertarian Science Fiction Association.
Fiction Alliance. Fiction Alliance.
There we go.
Yes, all fiction, yes.
So
I am kind of in between, I would say. I've gotten, as per the stereotype, I've gotten more conservative with age. I started as a card-carrying libertarian. Literally, Libertarian Party used to have membership cards, and I had one. And now, yes, I am more on the conservative side. And of course, it does show in my fiction, and it shows in all of my writing, because I feel if I am an author, the big point of the writing is to share your worldview. So it is what I do to an extent.
No, that's fine. I'm just thinking it might tailor nicely into fit nicely into the conversation. Anyway, so we have 4 people viewing. Let's see if we can get more viewers than we have people in the stream. It's been happening the last couple, so which is exciting. All right, so on to today's topic. The question is, do conservatives and liberals write science fiction differently? Or just write fiction generally differently, I suppose. The question was inspired, or the topic was inspired by a comment posted on John's blog. So I'll read that out for everyone. The general idea is about non-political differences between fiction by leftist authors and by conservative authors. For instance, I've noticed that for authors who are more conservative, family generally figures importantly in their stories. However, for more left-wing authors, mostly published by the big houses these days, family is a minor element, if it's mentioned at all. Orson Scott Card's books prominently feature family, Even John's Golden Phoenix books, written when he was an atheist, have family as an important element. In contrast, the two Scalzi books I've read barely mention the characters.
They're not called the Golden Phoenix books. They're called the Golden Age books.
The Golden Age? Okay.
Yes.
And hello, Judgy's joined us now.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
We can. So
Hi, Daddy.
Hey there. Glad to see you made it. All right, I'm going to turn my mic off till I eat something because I haven't had anything to eat all day. But I'll be with you in a moment. I'll be listening.
No problem. In contrast, the two Scalzi books I've read barely mention the characters' families at all. Terry Pratchett's books very rarely involve family to a significant degree. I'm sure given more time I could find more examples. This pattern, by the way, makes me suspect that Jim Butcher leans right. Another difference is how the hero wins. In a conservative author's work, victory often comes by way of courage and self-sacrifice. Even if he doesn't die, the hero puts himself in a place where he is likely to die. In a more leftist book, on the other hand, victory will commonly come by way of being clever. Almost anything by Asimov probably exemplifies this. Have you guys seen these? Are there other patterns which separate authors along these lines? I just had a thought while I was reading that out. It's not a book. It's actually Star Trek. The original Star Trek. I don't know. I grew up on the Next Generation series. I just had a thought that it's interesting. The Next Generation series definitely fits the mold of cleverness wins the day, and family is somewhat an afterthought, barring a few episodes here and there. But Deep Space Nine quite a few of the story arcs revolve around Ben Sisko and his son Jake. So, which was odd because Star Trek is normally considered quintessentially left wing all the way through. But maybe that's why I like DS9 the best. Anyway, just a random thought. So, who wants to go first?
Well, I can mention that as entertaining as a John Scalzi book can be, it's not a fair comparison to compare it to John C. Wright's literary talent. It's a whole nother world. But I would say one major exception I can see just right off of the bat, and it might be the exception that proves the rule with the family issue, is the writings of Stephen King, who is fairly politically active in the left. He's a very skilled author, and he creates very believable family dynamics that feature prominently and centrally in most of his works. And it's a major part of it. And the dynamic with the heroes in it usually isn't outwitting the great evil. It's usually either a triumph for virtue, or they fail because they fail by virtue and conviction, and evil wins, making it horror in truth. But that is that he keeps to that very classical kind of structure, and yet he's very left-leaning.
I wonder if that's an example of I've noticed in many times authors who are very left-leaning politically outside of the literary world tend to write very conservative stories. Conservative in this sense meaning following classical models and plot lines in the writing. Now, unfortunately, if I say that, then the thesis that conservative writing is different from liberal writing then just becomes a kind of circular argument. So it may just be that Stephen King is the exception that tests the rule to see whether it's correct or not.
Could it be that could it be is this too cynical? Maybe left-wing authors are crap.
I would say they are, but only in a limited way. I would say if you draw a distinction between liberals of the old school, let's say Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry. Liberals of the old school do not necessarily write crap because they still had enough connection with human nature and human life to understand what stories are supposed to be about. Recently, in recent years,
that's what I meant. Yeah.
Something happened to the liberal movement. They lost their minds and became what I call the alt-left, which I also call Morlocks or social justice warriors, where the cultural Marxism has completely taken over their brains, and they can no longer tell a proper story. They can't portray a family because a family is thought to be an oppressive part of the patriarchy. They can't portray heroism because there's no one in the world who is heroic. Everyone's either a victim based on being born a victim, or they're a victimizer. And victimizers can never be portrayed sympathetically in any way. Your plate is clinking and the microphone, dear. So I think that for the alt-left, this generation of leftists, their ability to tell a coherent story is very severely limited. But for older leftists, I don't see that. They still had some good stories.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. The observation was it tends to be the leftists that are published these days. Maybe part of the problem is because it leans so heavily one way, more garbage gets through. So whereas the conservative stuff that actually gets noticed and makes an impact tends to be better just because it has to be.
There is, as to what you said, John, about, something that's important to remember about Stephen King is that he is, in fact, a very conservative writer, but he's a conservative from Maine, which means he's an old-fashioned liberal. That's as just about as conservative as anybody gets in New England. Remember, Arlo Guthrie is registered as a Republican in Massachusetts, a thing that would be inconceivable anywhere else in the country.
That's true.
Would you say the same thing about Gene Roddenberry? Because his shows in the first season of Star Trek always struck me as being rather conservatively themed, even ones where he took on rather liberal views, like the episode where the guys who are half black, half white, if this be my battlefield, and it was make a statement against race relations. The agitator in that episode was not portrayed sympathetically. He was portrayed as part of the problem, which is a very unusual stance for... No modern liberal would take that stance, though I would see how an old-fashioned liberal might.
I think one of the differences is the old-fashioned... Oh, I'm talking with my mic off. Nope, it's on. I'll look at that. I think one of the differences is that the old-fashioned liberals, their storytelling came first. The very thing that Sad Puppies has been asking for all along. Their storytelling came first when they wrote, and their ideas may have colored or influenced their story, but they weren't primary. With the extremists, and basically the cribally alt-left crowd or extremist crowd, extremists, they have to have everything kind of fit the party line, if you think of it as the way the Russians used to do things. So then it starts affecting the actual storytelling. But just being liberal or just being conservative in the old-fashioned sense of not being an extremist, I don't think necessarily takes away from the quality of storytelling. What I thought was interesting in the original question was, I thought the first part of the question, the answer might be yes, and the second part might be no, by which I mean, I definitely would not be surprised if nowadays, maybe not in the past, but nowadays, there was a lot more families in conservative stories than in liberal stories. But I'm not entirely sure that what's going on with Asimov is, I'm not sure about the cleverness versus sacrifice. I don't know if that's conservative liberal or if that's genre. For instance, I can hardly think of any mystery ever that ends with somebody making a startling, courageous sacrifice. Mysteries, by the nature of what they're presenting, have to end with somebody doing something clever. Because that's what you're promising your audience is, I'm going to give you a puzzle and then you're going to solve the puzzle. They may have a moment where they have to do something dramatic, but the actual crux of the story should be a revelation, a figuring out. And Asimov wrote that kind of story. A lot of his stories were like mysteries. So I don't know. I mean, you would have to look at conservative versus liberal mysteries to get an idea if they're done differently. Well, I think that the kind of story that has a heroic, dramatic, sacrificing conclusion tend to be adventures. And you could say that resolving an adventure with a mystery-style ending might be more liberal than conservative. But I would have to look at more books than I've looked at on the subject to think that was the case. I kind of think that the clever versus sacrifice might be an adventure versus mystery issue and the issue of family versus the thing that John is always talking about, which is how all these modern TV shows are full of groups of unrelated characters who talk about being a family. Did you say this already, Hanson? I'll let you say it. You go ahead and tell them.
I haven't said it, but I would say I don't watch much TV, but I do tend to watch the superhero shows that are being put out by CBS or CW or Netflix. And I notice that they often, frequently, refer to the group of the team as a family and promote the family as a primary virtue as to what motivates them to action. And there was a similar thing in the movie that just came out, Suicide Squad. There was a line or two where one of the supervillains said, "Well, we're now a family," and of course they're not. They're a team. And I myself thought that was due to the lack of male friendship or team spirit in modern culture, language, and literature, so that in order to portray the emotion, the writers didn't have anything else to analogize it to than family loyalty. And also it has the advantage of the idea that you can build your own family, that it's not related to sexual nature, is very welcome by the left.
Speaking of TV shows and families, have you ever noticed that most of the Pixar movies, the only one that I can recall to have like a complete like family unit, everyone else is either an orphan or something else.
What about Brave?
Brave
that
had a
Pixar?
family unit.
Oh yes,
That was
that
Pixar.
was
Also-
Disney Pixar, wasn't it?
Also, Inside Out, which was one of their better ones.
Yeah.
But you're
There's
right.
a
It's
handful
very
of them that are family.
What about Up? Oh, I suppose not family.
Well, it was. I mean, it was a family at the beginning, but the wife died.
Well, I know.
Sorry, I didn't mean to spoil the surprise ending.
Well, no.
Yeah,
just
both of them had a family, but they died. Someone died before the story actually started.
Well, Disney does that a lot in terms of having the remnant of a family. Like, there's usually one incompetent father and no mom around, like in Aladdin, for example. But I think that's more of part. I don't know if that's conservative versus liberal, as opposed to storytelling versus realism. Because realistically, if your mom was still alive and around, she would stop you from going on the adventure, and your dad would go kill Jafar, so you wouldn't have to do anything.
That's true.
I think I figured something out, or at least I have a possibility. So I don't know if the thesis or the answer is firmly placed, but now that I'm thinking about it, the counterexamples that I have, where a lot of you have these classical themes of family and nobility and all of this, is, as said, a lot of the older works. Really, it started dying out in the 80s and is mostly gone from major publishers. And I think the reason might be the gatekeepers. There are probably lots of liberal authors that are writing stories about family and heroism and all this, and they're not getting published either, just like the conservative authors aren't, because it's not, the story hasn't been rendered into a caricature to push a point.
I also had a question about corollary of our thesis. The example of Stephen King, I haven't read very much horror in my life, so I'm not familiar with the genre. Mm-hmm. I would assume that a family is more vulnerable to the feelings of horror than, for example, if your main character is an orphan with no friends.
Oh, yes.
Because if people worry about little Billy, their child, wandering out into the graveyard where the mysterious murders have occurred, the family connection makes the terror more poignant.
Yeah, and he does that very well. You feel...
That reaction that
So my question is, if the lamplighter thesis that certain genres are favorable to certain types of family stories, such as, or the example she used, mystery stories, you almost have to have an intellectual solution. Is the horror genre prone to portraying families in order to get that poignancy of the terror across?
Not necessarily.
Whereas science fiction stories...
Poe and Lovecraft didn't do much with family. It was kind of cursory in the early Nightland, and it was all over the place with your work on Awaken the Nightland. And so I think it's something that can be horror. It's a pretty horrifying place. When you feel the ice starting to form on your shoulder as you realize the sun is never going to rise in that desolate wasteland, and things are out there waiting just for the chance to crawl in, it's pretty horrifying.
I thought it was a romance story.
It was that too. I don't know how you managed to combine both things perfectly.
that wasn't me. That was William Hope Hodgson. I take no credit for that.
Okay.
I'm humble.
But what John does take credit for it was his idea to say, okay, the first original book was about love between a man and a woman. What other kinds of love can he cover? So the second story, the first story John did was about friendship, and the next story he did Antigone, so it was about brothers and sisters, and so he covered different relationships from the one that was in the original story, which was the family of husband and wife.
If you haven't read C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, I was going through that kind of in order.
Okay.
But my point still, I want to stand. If we're talking about whether liberals and conservatives write different kinds of stories, I also ask whether or not genres call for different types of stories. Because I would think that adventure genres would tend not to call for family-type stories, because families usually don't go on adventures.
Yeah, with the exception of Fantastic Four.
Fantastic Four's not a family. I mean, they get the Sue Storm marries Reed Richards, and the brother is she's the brother.
It's a husband, a wife, and her brother, and their friend. So it's kind of like family, but they're not a family the way
The Incredibles
is a family. Yeah.
Johnny Quest.
Now with the
Johnny Quest is a good example, and the wife is dead. Mrs. Benton Quest is gone.
Right, so, she shut that right down.
I mean, the reason...
No, but it's a family. I would say it's a family structure.
The reason for not having moms, I think, is the one that you gave. That Disney already has to put across in a cartoon a lot of characters in a quick amount of time. And if you have to introduce two parents, as a writer, you don't put on more characters than you have a place for.
And
the position of parent is one that you really only need often to have one person represent in a story. And when the story is like a fairy tale or a story about kids, often the parents will almost be one character, you shouldn't do this. Yes, dear,
Yeah. The parents and lady. The parents and lady.
The father is usually buffoon, unless it's I think Simba was the last. I think Lion King was the last that had an actual.
Well,
right, but he got killed off. So it's okay to be impressed when you're off stage.
But I'm willing to cut Disney some slack for that, because fathers usually buffoons even in the original fairy tales, or they're absent or they're not present. I mean, Cinderella's father was dead.
Or it's a story about a father who's solving a problem with his kid there, rather than a story about kids, and that's why they do it. So I think that's a different issue from the issue of having good stories about families. A good story about a family.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So you were saying with adventure stories, a lot of times like the whole family isn't on there doing the adventure. Used as like the motivation for whatever the main character is.
Swiss Family Robinson.
Hero, like trying to there's a hero and they're lost and they're trying to get back to their family. In a way, wouldn't that be a strong family element, even though the family isn't present in the story? They're the hero's point to go to.
Well, oddly enough, I'll point out that Lost in Space Family Robinson, did have the family as the main character, whereas Star Trek had a military set up as the main character.
But I thought April's question was, does a family have to be on stage to be a family story? And I think the answer is not necessarily the case. If somebody's doing something, was it Taken, the movie about trying to save your daughter?
Yes, Taken.
That's a family story, even if the family only appears very briefly in the beginning or the end of the story.
A divorced dad, by the way, a guy from a broken home.
Okay, well, still, a story about trying to save your kids or get your family back together or something like that is also family motivated.
That movie is very near and dear to my heart, because I, of course, would love to go kill anyone who kidnapped my daughter. but I'm not Liam Nielsen. So
I'm very happy that you're not, and luckily no one has kidnapped anyone, because otherwise it could be kind of embarrassing.
you're happy I'm not Liam Nielsen? He's a very handsome man.
I would prefer to have you.
You guys did
Oh,
Or as good a moderator.
Well, John, if it makes you feel any better, I know a whole bunch of people with guns who would happily go after anyone who threatened your family. So
Well,
don't worry
what
about
I would
that.
do, what I would do if someone threatened my family is I'd merely post a blog on my blog saying, "Dear readers, I have this guy that I need killed," and they'd go do it for me because I have the best readers in the world. They've bailed me out
Hopefully
2 and 3
they would
times now.
Catch him and arrest him and bring him to trial.
Oh yes, of
kill
course. I meant
him.
catch him and arrest him and then
You don't want
hang
to
him from a lamppost.
kill.
Well, it
Your
depends.
boys.
It depends. If they threaten one of my boys, yes, trial. If they threaten my daughter, kill them.
Nonetheless,
This, by the way,
keep in
this,
mind,
by
it
the
could be
way-
a false accusation. You have
Now,
to
what-
have them arrested and tried.
keep in mind, this is why they don't have the mothers on stage during adventure stories.
Exactly.
Because the mom would always stop the dad from killing the guy. See? I mean, if Batman was married and he was about to, shoot the Joker or something, she'd stop him. She'd go, "Bruce, what are you doing?"
You're supposed to not use a gun. You're Batman.
That's right.
I was just thinking I could see the post on John's blog now. Who wants to be a character in my next story?
Take out this evil man who's harmed my daughter, and you shall.
We have a comment. We have a comment from one of the people listening to the stream. An observation by Wolfman at Large, because I have the chat working now. I figured it out.
Oh, good.
Adventure stories call for disorganized bands of ruffians. They may turn into a family by the end of the story.
That is true too, but that's a little bit, I think, like unless by a family you mean that they actually get married, which does happen. It's a bit like what John used to describe the recipe for a World War II movie, where you had a guy from Brooklyn who was tough, a guy from Texas, a guy from the South, a guy from the Midwest, and they couldn't get along and they hated each other. And, by the end they were a band of brothers, and usually the most obnoxious one was the guy who was in charge because he had learned the most. And if you mean family in that sense.
And the lieutenant always gets killed off, so the
they
next
have
guy
to solve
has
the problems on
he
their
has
own.
to pass the torch to the next generation. That's also an element of those kind of stories.
I think I saw that movie.
But I think that's a different type of family. That from actual, mother, father, children, grandparents, grandchildren style family. Not that it's less important, but that one of them is currently in favor and the other one is not.
I have a question about our definition. In the movie Pirates of the Caribbean, by the third film, the blacksmith and the daughter of the governor get married during a sea fight in the middle of a tornado hurricane while there are sea monsters battling around them and the East India Company is blowing smithereens around them and they're being assaulted by supernatural monsters from the bottom of the ocean. And they get married by the pirate captain while sword fighting the bad guys. Is that considered a family movie or is that a romance? Because romance is when the guy and the girl get together, and a family movie is when do you have to have kids? I mean, what's the definition here? What kind of thing are we talking about?
How about Terminator 2? Is that a family movie?
It's a mother and a son.
Not to mention a boy and his, attack dog.
A boy and
played
his
by
robot.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yep.
Yeah, a boy and his robot story. Which are always heartwarming.
Sorry. Another observation from Bradford Walker. Japan, in fact, has a word for a pseudo family, Nakima. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that.
That's cool though.
What's the official translation? Band of brothers?
I don't know.
It
I don't
may
know.
just be its own thing, potentially.
A man living with a female robot.
Someone else said.
So I saw a Futurama episode where it said not to do that.
Someone else said it's Nakama. I suspect that may be Japanese is a funny language. It's been too long since I last looked at it back when I took an intro course years ago for a job I had.
I just remembered something. I think it was Penguin and Tor had put out a post saying that unless, they weren't taking any new stories from any new authors unless it fit this narrow definition of, all the social progressive checkboxes.
Tor.
I got down about halfway through the list before I said the heck with them, but that would exclude not just conservatives, but that would exclude most of the fiction I have that's been written by liberals over the years, too. They'd just be flat out, because they didn't
Do you
check
agree with
every
me that
box.
that some brain disease has seized upon the liberals in recent years, that they're different from the previous generation? But the old liberals still had some humanity left, but the new ones are just Morlocks. They're
Well,
not.
it's
they're not
easy
even
to
people
tell the
anymore?
difference. If they are the group of people who have as one of their codes, nothing you say can offend me, which you could have practically been certain that every liberal would have said back when I was a young liberal, then they're old style liberal. If they're offended by everything that happens, then they're a puritanical new style liberal.
Not that there's anything new about that style. It's, there was, the Germans had a word for it in the 1920s, Kulturbolschewismus.
Oh, no, there's nothing new about that type of extremism, but
but there's nothing, there's also nothing
about changes. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, there's also, there is nothing new about the particular extremes they go to. There's nothing new about the antipathy to the family, which is what Brave New World and 1984 are both essentially about.
Yep.
There is nothing new about the ideological witch hunts and presenting long checklists of ideological points that you have to conform to. It was George Orwell quoted Edward Upward back in the 1930s saying, "No book written at the present time can be good unless it is written from a Marxist standpoint."
But here's a thought. The far-out whack jobs are nothing new to the human species. But I think when you look back at a lot of the earlier publishers, I know from what I've read that Del Rey loved sci-fi and took it up for the love of it, not that he thought it was going to be as successful as it was. And there's a lot of things like that, where they were trying to make money or they were trying to advance a literary interest as opposed to a political interest. The folks that I think are running the gate, who aspired to be and eventually became gatekeepers today, it's about control. It's not about art. It's not about even money. They're making terrible business decisions. They could make a bucket of money compared to what they're doing now if they would not do this. So I think it's almost like I can't tell if it's a general cultural shift or not, because the folks that are running it, the folks that are in charge, the folks that are limiting these things, which led to Sad Puppies amongst other things, have basically closed down debate. Theirs is the only voice I hear screaming.
I would argue that it's a general cultural shift because the behavior on college campuses of modern alt liberals, of modern Morlocks, is very different from the liberals that I saw when I was a youth. Let me just use one example. When I was young, women on Star Trek wore miniskirts, and Hugh Hefner, the pornographer, was a leftist. In the modern
old
day,
Star Trek uniforms.
In the modern day, portraying a woman as attractive offends the left the same way it offends Muslims. In fact, the new left and the Muslims have a lot in common in terms of their puritanical totalitarianism.
And they have a lot in common with what was going on in the 1930s. There's a when a society reaches a breaking point, culture reaches a breaking point. Europe reached that breaking point after World War I. The United States is only just now really going through the same thing. This is, if you can talk about old style liberals, but you're talking about a very narrow frame of reference. You're talking about the lifetimes of the people present and the U.S. only, which is
yeah. Not to mention,
unable to hear us or talk to us. Does anybody have any advice that we could give her, or something she could try that you guys have tried if something like this happened?
Sorry, she can't hear us or can't talk to us?
She says her sound isn't working and she can't hear us and we can't hear her.
Has she tried restarting the machine?
I'll suggest that.
Oh, we have a clarification. The word is nakama, the Japanese word for pseudo family is nakama, and it means colleague, compatriot, friend, or comrade. Although apparently Urban Dictionary says it's it's effectively got. I mean, that's like what the literal translation is, but it has a sort of deeper connotation than that.
It's basically what we used to understand in the West and have apparently seem to have forgotten about it. Very close teammates and friends. They're not your family, but they're yeah.
If you did Damien and Pythias' story today, or if you did Frodo and Sam Gamgee, they'd have to be homosexual lovers for the leftists to understand what the relationship was.
And that's the worst thing about this whole sexualizing of everything is friendship is being just torn apart and abandoned. People don't seem to understand what it is anymore. That being willing to die for your friend when there's no other component to it.
Well, I want to echo what Tom Simon is saying about this being an old movement, because of course the new part of it from the American point of view is it hasn't come to our shores before. We've never had cultural Marxists running things in America before. Certainly not running the intellectual life of the country. And intellectual Marxists hate the family. They don't want a person to have any religion. They don't want a person to have any loyalties to any smaller guilds, groups, or communities other than the nation state, other than Caesar.
Well, I was going to say they love family and they love religion. It's just it's got to be their family and their religion or else.
Yes, exactly. Heck, there was actually in the Soviet Union when they had a free love movement originally. It had to be wiped out by Stalin because it's no. We need children. We need to keep spawning for the great Soviet experiment to keep going forward.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Unfortunately, in our experiment to produce the ideal socialist man, we have found that we have to use non-ideal bourgeois wombs.
What a mess.
No, that's one of the nice things about...
Yeah, Marina, can we hear you? That's not a good sign.
Yeah.
I heard something for a brief moment, and then that was it.
That's hopeful.
Technical problems. Dang it.
Please stand by. I would like to propose further that what we're really looking at is not so much a divide between liberals and conservative as a divide between far left ideologues whom the liberals tend to go along with to get along because they can stomach it, and the conservatives don't because it's just too far out.
I think you're right.
And I think a lot of what I've done a lot of thinking about this entirely by accident in the last week or so, and I think it really comes down in a great part to the attitude towards agency.
Can you define that term?
Because where you really, if you never mind the family, if you really want to set off a roaring faction fight of the Morlocks versus everybody else, start talking about heroes.
Right.
There are
responsible for what they do. How can you have heroism?
Right. There are three attitudes. I'm going to crib shamelessly from Aristotle. You can divide stories into three classes based on their attitude towards heroism. You've got the two extremes and the golden mean in the middle. On the one hand, you've got the melodrama where the hero arrives with he's already got his white hat nailed on, or he's got his super suit or his gumshoes or whatever it is by which you know that he is a hero. He goes, he distributes socks on the jaw and justice with the toe of his boot, and he restores order, and then you can carry on and reset to zero for the next exciting episode. The hard left doesn't mind that so much because it's so obviously unrealistic. They say, okay, we can accept that, but we'll label it trash. It isn't necessarily, but they can label it as such. Obviously, anybody that has somebody walking around in funny colored pajamas and a cape is obviously garbage. I'm sure you would all agree, right?
Well, they do keep staring at Marvel films.
At the other extreme, you have the anti-drama. where there are no heroes, there are no villains, problems never get solved, and people just stew and wallow in their own ineffectuality, which is basically what every character other than the fantasy hero is compelled to do in the melodrama. So it's just the same thing with the hero left out, and the problem never gets solved. And this, of course, is what they like to think of as literary fiction, although it is nothing of the kind. Most of it is just muck.
It also work for like a noir film or something like that?
It can do, but
noir films have a slightly different take on it. Usually the gumshoe there, like in, for example, The Big Sleep, is a guy with some shattered ideals, but he still tries to carry them out, even though he doesn't think that they're legitimate necessarily any longer.
Yeah, Puddleglum and trench coat.
Cynical, but idealistic, many of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the middle you have the heroic drama. And I'm not necessarily talking about drama in the stage sense, but in terms of the structure of the story. And that's where you're talking about somebody who isn't Superman, or Sherlock Holmes, or somebody that was just handed to you as a hero for the situation, where you have characters who have to learn to have agency and solve the problems, and they overcome a crescendo of increasing problems before they reach the boss fight at the end. This, of course, is also the structure of most video games. It's about how the lead character becomes a hero, and the hard left reacts to this with horror and disgust, because it's an axiom with them that nobody has actual agency. Everything is up to the forces of history or the state or, the great... I mean, it's an idea that they inherited whole from Karl Marx, never bothered to digest it or question it or improve upon it or alter it in any way. It's just part of the furniture.
The reason why we call them cultural Marxists is they just take the Marxist analysis that Marxists apply to economics, and they apply it to all human institutions. Every human institution to them is a case of mutually exclusive Darwinian competition. Even romance, even male-female relationships are the males are the exploited and the women are the exploitees. So
which
yeah,
kind of
you're right.
ice cream you choose is an exploitative choice.
Correct. So there can be no heroes in their stories. That's why the stories are so boring, so grindingly dull.
Tom reminded me of something that kind of dug at me, and it's again this kind of present versus past. So we all remember episodes 4 through 6 of Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker undergoes this long training program, like he's talking about.
That is one of the perfect examples of that kind of heroic drama.
Yeah, and he's a farm boy. He can fly, he can shoot, but he goes from that to Jedi Master. And it's a long, hard process, and he has failures all the way along there. It's not a straight line. And then we have episode 7, which is visually beautiful, and I like all the actors, but we take someone, again, from nowhere, and we just flick a switch, and she's a Jedi Knight. And I'm like, wait a minute, where's the training sequences? Where's the tests and the failures?
Well, it's
blood, sweat, and
that's true,
tears.
but I'm not going to make any judgment on that until we get the next 2 episodes, because there are half a dozen explanations, including that she could have been trained at that school that Luke was running that got broken up and other things like that. So, I mean, it seems to me to be easy to fill in.
But he's talking about what we saw on stage. And
right,
in terms of the story arc on stage so far...
True, but I'm saying I'm willing to give the writers a benefit of the doubt until I see the end. Now, if I get to the end and they haven't explained it, then I'll have the same reaction.
So it's clear she knew how to fight with the staff, and that explains why she's cleaning house with that early in the movie. She's handed a pistol more than halfway through, and she looks like the character looks like she's about to fumble it, and she's fumbling with the safety, and then she's mowing down every shot at while she's running and dodging through cover through the forest.
Which is so inaccurate because we know how hard it is to hit anything in that universe.
Yeah. I'm not bothered by Han Solo
by a friend who's a staff fighter that in the end scene when she picks up the lightsaber, she's doing all staff moves with it.
And that was cool. That was a cool touch.
Yeah.
But
Now, I
basically,
have a
What they
theory.
needed was a line of dialogue where somebody said, "Look, she's fighting like a staff fighter," because
Yeah,
otherwise, only people who've been to staff fighting school got how cool that was.
jarred
Well,
me through
one-
the fourth wall a couple times.
Hey, one of the things I like whenever somebody wants to point out, oh, well, she's a Mary Sue character. Look at how she beat up whatever the emo cis guy was, Kylo
Emo
Ren.
Vader is his name.
Yeah.
Vader emo, Darth emo, Darth
Darth
emo.
Emo.
Yes, and it's, oh, well, she's wiping the floor with him. It's like, excuse me, we pointed out earlier on that the Wookiee's bowcaster is basically the sci-fi equivalent of a howitzer, and we shot this guy with it earlier.
Yeah,
He was
Yeah,
really
that's
wounded.
true.
10
That's true.
minutes
He's
early.
wounded.
Yeah, so of course she's going to wipe the floor with him because she kept running away. It's okay.
It-
I'm
it
going
was
to fall
even a real
down now from
fight.
blood loss.
Yeah, no,
But
that made a
there's
certain
not
amount of
much of Mary
sense.
Sue. There's also the fact that she knows the Millennium Falcon better than Han Solo. She
Yeah.
fights as well as a Jedi. She doesn't need to be rescued when the guy comes to rescue her,
Or training force techniques.
and so on and so forth. What is she
justify
bad
those.
at? In the first movie, I could tell you what each of the characters was bad at.
Manners?
I will remind you that we had an entire chat on this subject, didn't we?
Yeah, it just
I
came
think
up
you can go
again.
back and you'll see that our opinions probably haven't changed that much.
There is
Oh.
one thing I loved about that movie, though, and it's something most people hated. They could have maybe done it better, but everyone saw Vader and they're like, "Wow, Vader's cool." And they saw Darth Maul and they're like, "Wow, Darth Maul's cool." They're frightening, but they're cool. They see Kylo Ren and he seems cool, and the mask comes off and he's pathetic. And real evil is pathetic.
No,
Now,
that's-
I have a theory if we could go back to a reason why the liberals hate the hero that throws so much.
Uh-huh.
My theory is, because you're saying, like, they think everyone's a victim. So you're either a victim or you're someone else or whatever, but they
He
don't.
is a victim or a villain.
And so my thought is, like, as I pointed out in my article, like, yesterday, was the sense of individuality is totally lost in that kind of, like, world. They don't really see the so much as it's a group of people.
Your microphone's breaking up, April. We can I can't hear you very
I
well.
can hear most of it.
Okay, let me try again. My theory
I, by the way,
is,
agree with her thought, because it seems to me that liberals, both old and new school liberals, regard people merely as parts of a collective. And if you put a black character on, he represents all blacks. If you put a woman character on, she represents all women. They don't think of them as having individual strengths and weaknesses.
that's what John. Thank you, John. I'll have to get a new microphone.
I don't know.
I think Marina's working again.
Yeah, I'm back.
There we go.
I didn't know what happened. I think my Google decided to stop working.
It's happened to me occasionally. I used to have it regularly that
Who knows?
the sound would just go off and I'd have to reboot. And then it stopped happening. I'm not sure why.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can. Can
Just
you hear
fine.
me?
we can all hear you.
Can you hear us?
Yes. What were you guys talking about?
We got
Are you
caught in a
still on the
digression about talking
conservative
about
liberal thing?
we got caught in a digression about Star Wars, but I myself would like to return to the
Okay.
topic of if whether or not liberals and conservatives write different types of stories.
I'd like to put a cap on the digression there by saying you can justify each one of those storytelling decisions one by one, but you throw them all together, and the sheer accumulation makes a Mary Sue, whether you intend it or not.
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
And then you're back into the category of the that I labeled the heroic melodrama. Oh, look at him. He's the hero because he got bitten by a radioactive spider. There's no development.
But this is liberal because she's the hero because she's a woman.
Well, yeah. Well, of course she has a magic hoo-ha.
No.
She is.
I think that's the
They're
first
implying
use of
she's
that word.
Skywalker's daughter.
What's that?
They're rather strongly implying she's Skywalker's daughter, which might also have something to do
Well,
with it.
maybe, but I've heard other theories too.
That means she's Aunt Beru's grandniece. That doesn't make her able to do everything automatically.
There are theories she's Skywalker's daughter, which, I mean, maybe they'll find out her mom was a female Jedi and she's got a huge amount of Jedi juice. There's also was a supposedly leaked script that had a very different background for her that, if it were the case, would kind of explain a lot of what happened. I'm not going to say what it is, just on the off chance it's actually the real one. It's more fun to be surprised. But
you've heard my theory that Dr. McCoy injected her with the same drug he used on the planet of Plato's stepchildren that gave her telekinetic powers, and that's how she
John pointed out that if Jedi blood, this was years ago, if Jedi blood had metachlorides in it, or whatever it is, that you could theoretically get Jedi juice by squeezing them hard enough, and then you could inject it into someone else. So maybe they just collected together all the dead younglings and got out the Jedi juice, and they injected it into some little kid.
I would like to point out that my charming and delightful wife is the one who portrayed the image of throwing bunches of dead children corpses into a juicer. I didn't say it. She said it.
I didn't come up with it on my own.
Do horror movies tend to have families in them, and do now, here's the problem I have with the whole question. The early
the real villain here is obviously Darth Popeil.
I'm sorry, I lost what?
The real villain here is obviously Darth Popeil. Yes, those of a certain generation get the reference.
I don't get it.
Oh, he was the Mr. Popeil. He had the Popeil pocket fisherman and the Popeil this and that. The gadget guy.
Yeah, Ron Popeil invented, right?
Yeah, he invented the juicer.
A horrible idea, but
in terms of whether or not liberals or conservatives tend to write families in stories,
yes.
In the 60s, most of the fiction I read when I was young, we tended to read several generations of science fiction because there just wasn't that much of it, and there wasn't someone trying to cut us off from the past the way there is these days. And I noticed that most of those stories, being adventure stories and being almost never had even romance in them, much less family romance in them. I can't think of a single Arthur C. Clarke story that has any.
It was all about ideas.
It was all about ideas. It was all quite abstract.
There was a very,
I can't recall any female characters from any H.P. Lovecraft story at all. For example,
there was a very good cynical commercial reason for that.
Yes.
The stories were those stories. The pulps were the successors to the penny dreadfuls. I've actually, shameless plug time, I've actually written about this at some length in an essay in my forthcoming collection, Superversive: Recovering the Tao of Fantasy.
Yay!
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 Which will be out real soon now. If I had not been recently ill, it would be out already. It's in the final stages. The thing is that those adventure stories were targeted as fiction for boys, and that meant they had to run the gamut of various kinds of censors and wowzers and dirty-minded little old lady librarians. And so you didn't have any romance in them because that was thought to be something that either boys wouldn't be interested in, or it would corrupt their virginally impressionable minds. And so, stay away, kryptonite, avoid.
And I'm with you, Tom. But even those busybodies weren't as bad.
Because Tom Swift's stories and were clearly boys' adventure stories, but they had families in them. They showed a normal, middle class
families. But you were not allowed to have any touching below the neck. There was, and the
yeah.
The other thing about the pulps is that they were predominantly a medium for short fiction, and if you had a story with new characters, that was not part of a continuing series, you didn't have time to introduce families in the amount of wood pulp that your editor would give you to write the story on.
That's also a good point, because most of the fiction I read when I was a kid was short stories. I mean, I think both Asimov and Heinlein are at least as famous for the short stories as they are for their novel-length works.
Mm-hmm.
And it is much easier to deal with family in a novel-length work because you've got more room you've got more room for character development. You don't have to stick as narrowly to the main incidents of the plot.
I would say the censors and all of that during that whole area and all the self-righteous busybodies were still more they were less toxic than the brand we have now, because at least there were tales worth reading.
Oh,
I can tell you why.
Yes.
Oh, I would say they were right.
The previous extremists were extreme in favor of morals. So at least they were actually encouraging something that actually was good and did produce a good society, even if they were being extreme about it.
The current
extremists are extremists in favor of immorality. And they don't agree with each other. And what they're standing for will change from moment to moment, from year to year.
Yeah.
So they're not producing anything.
This is true, but they don't view themselves as being immoral. They view themselves as being the height of morality. They're
They
absolutely
view themselves
certain
as being
that they're doing the right thing.
And in favor of,
Even if-
of enlightenment.
Yeah, they're certain they're doing the right thing, and they always believe that, even when they were doing the exact opposite and believed the exact opposite
That's
2
the
years
key.
ago.
Yes,
That's
it's
the
not,
Yeah,
it's not
their
really
claim to moral
morality.
superiority is that their claim to moral superiority is that they favor sexual immorality above all things, and that they are willing to tolerate any sin. That's their one. They only have one rule in their moral code, which is
And the result
don't object
is,
to immorality.
if you're extreme to some, extreme extremism always just goes off the deep end, because the person they get more and more narrow in what they're defining. But if you're somewhat extreme about a moral code, you can at least kind of live up to the moral code. And if it's a good moral code, the result might be good, even if it's squelching in some horrible way, other way.
You guys might have.
I've read Heinlein's juveniles, and I've also read his grown-up books, and his juveniles are better because they were edited.
Right, but what I'm saying is
they were edited partly on the basis of a moral code that Heinlein himself wanted to overthrow, which was sexual chastity.
what I was trying to say is the current group, because they're merely trying to be extreme beyond the previous, a great deal of what they're calling for right now is the exact opposite of what the same people were calling for 20, 30 years ago.
Well,
Their attitude towards what you are and are not supposed to do towards or as a woman, for instance, is exactly the opposite of what they wanted before.
It'll change to something tomorrow. Does C.S. Lewis called these guys, what did he call them, self-righteous busybodies or something like that? Where they're unlike an honest tyrant who just wants to seize property or whatever. There's no limit to what they'll do because they're convinced of their own righteousness.
Yeah, but as I get older, I think the self-righteous busybodies of the 1950s were right, and the people who were rebelling against them were wrong, and I miss them. Let me give you a specific example. I just came across a film with the character of the Batwoman in it. Batwoman is Catherine Kane, socialite who decided to put on a bat costume and go fight crime. Is her backstory. She was originally introduced in the 1950s, or at least I should say the first incarnation of her was introduced in the 1950s in order to counteract rumors spread by Dr. I forget his name, Werther's Seduction of the Innocent book, where it was claimed that Batman was a homosexual. But the modern version of Batwoman isn't the love interest to try to stop the rumors of homosexuality. She's a homosexual, and that's basically the only thing the character is known for. Just any other personality besides just being a slap in the face of the church by being a notorious lesbian. And so if you're gonna choose between two groups of self-righteous busybodies, the guys who are in favor of normal human natural decency sanity, I have a lot more sympathy for, and I don't consider what they're doing to be wrong.
Here's another example. So on Facebook there was a tweet or something, and it was, does science fiction make your workplace a hostile environment for women? So the modern idea is tear down those science fiction. It says tear down those science fiction posters, get rid of And so when I was young, the idea was we wanted to be allowed to do something women had never been allowed to do. We wanted to join into places and work in places where they said this is not a good environment for women. So we said we're going to think like the man, we're going to act like the man, we're going to talk like the man. And talking like one of the boys was something that feminists were really proud of, okay? And so women went into scientific situations, and they went in and they tried to act like guys. Nowadays, the attitude is, oh, those scientific situations need more women, but in order to have women in there, the men have to stop acting like men. Not that these women are so good and they want to be there so much, so hard, that they're going to put up with the fact that the situation is naturally different than they are, but we have to make it all nice and fuzzy for them. So they're equivalently saying women can't hack it. Now, I don't have anything against the idea women should be allowed to be feminine and don't have to talk like men. But really, I mean, it's exactly the opposite of what it used to be.
Well, a large part of the problem these idiots have is they don't actually pay attention to anything. For example, the household I grew up in, my mother was a clinical laboratory scientist, which means backroom, running lab tests, and she is part of the American Society for Clinical Laboratory Scientists, which are, for the record, 95% female. So trying to say, well, it's science fiction or men dominating your environment, the answer is no, not really. And anyone trying to spin this is either ignorant or lying.
A similar spin happens when the leftists nowadays talk about the history of science fiction, where they say that women were not welcome. I have an extensive collection of covers from the old pulp magazines, and whenever I go through them, I keep noticing Lee Brackett's name showing up over and over again, and other women writers who were they're fairly prevalent. So I don't understand what the idea was that they were being kept out of the field, and who would keep them out anyway? And how would you keep them out unless you meet them in person? They send you a manuscript and they sign by their initials. How would you even know?
Yeah.
The idea is ridiculous, but the ridiculous idea is adopted because it fits into their Marxist faith system. Their dogma says there has to be a victim group and there has to be a victimizing group, and the only way to signal virtue is to side with the victim group. So even when there's no victims, you have to pretend there are victims.
Yes, not to mention one of the science fiction works that keeps being ignored. If I say the name J.D. Robb, does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. For those of you
It's just me.
Oh, okay. I will elaborate. Now, J.D. Robb is a series of science fiction police procedurals. They're basically murder mysteries set in 2060-something. And it's written by J.D. Robb. However, as it's not a secret, if you look at the covers, it's J.D. Robb is an alias for Nora Roberts, the romance writer.
Yep.
Okay.
So
And when she went from writing romance to writing a different, more science fiction type series, she, put out a different name. But as you say, it's not a secret, and it's just a different approach.
And most of the people I know got started reading science fiction read Andre Norton. They read Andre Norton in Heinlein Juveniles.
Andre Norton was the lady.
Yep.
okay.
And most of the fantasy readers I know really are fans of a writer named Rawling.
I think I heard of that name.
Oh,
Yep.
It actually took me a while to realize that J.K. Rowling was a girl.
Well, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are also women. They just use their initials to hide them. Jane and Sissy are their names. Julia Tolkien. Lewis.
Celia Lewis and Jane Tolkien. I don't think so.
I still remember your take on the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yeah, that's from the same. That's from the same world that comes from, where the history has been lost.
Yeah.
We've run out of topics. What's the next topic on our?
We do have another topic, but
Well,
I wanted to make a quick.
Cloggled the panel.
I wanted to make a quick, unrelated comment before we got to our new topic, and that is somebody mentioned earlier, John offering to put someone in their novel in return for access to not statement. But
Revenge. It's a very perfectly natural act. Ask Count Monte
just
Cristo.
posted on Facebook the Onion article about HR sending out a note that to remind people, because it keeps happening, that you're not supposed to write revenge on the whiteboard in the boardroom in blood. I thought it was hilarious. Anyway, but that was not what I was going to say. So we are trying to come up with a list of incentives for less violent things for John to use on Patreon. So if anybody listening has anything they would like, you could write in as a comment or let us know privately. Things like drawing pictures or writing short stories about favorite characters or something other than shooting people. Shooting people is not we're not going to put out there.
A video of John doing Uhura's fan dance. No, that'd turn people off.
That would be the kind of thing that we would have to be the other way. Like if you pay us, we won't do that.
Even John, unless you pay me, you'll be subjected to it.
Yeah, see, and we wouldn't do that.
I don't really know if that would be effective, because the world has already been subjected to Jim Hines in drag doing book cover poses.
Well,
I think I'm more uncomely than Mr. Hines. Yeah. You'll have to be strapped into one of those chairs like in Clockwork Orange with your eyelids wide open. And I'm not doing it. I have some dignity.
I didn't want to think about it. Let's move on before I actually accidentally picture it. I think the next thing we wanted to talk about was Noble Bright. David, do you want to talk about it for a bit?
Yeah, it's just the beginning of a concept. I hadn't thought we were ready to float it out here, but the concept of far noble and heroic science fiction in the distant future, mankind exiled from the galaxy and seeking to return, and filled with Arthurian themes, and basically as much over the top in terms of both science fiction and fantasy over Star Wars as imaginable. So we're definitely looking for people that are interested in the project, and hopefully we'll be able to get that going.
Tell them about the Cleomancers.
Oh, yes, the Cleomancers, the history mages that manipulate history insidiously over centuries.
So in a way, it's like Menelaus and Blackie, but they're mages and don't have an epic chess game going.
Well, I imagine there'd be all sorts. There'd probably be necromancers and whatever else. I'm kind of trying to take the exact opposite approach to the gatekeepers of sci-fi and try and have an open door rather than a closed gate. This is something that's we're trying to create, not destroy. So the very idea is to actually get this incredibly broad avenue. The main thing that I'm not looking to see in it is true nihilism, which is swarms so many science fiction works and even works that later turns in that fashion. And I've lost all taste for that kind of thing. So, heroism in the stars.
Anyway, I don't know if you want to hold off discussing it because we're still working on it in any more detail. That's cool, but yeah, I think it's a great idea, and we should definitely move forward with some joy.
Of course, the truly wonderful thing to do with that would be to come up with a manuscript and submit it to one of the usual suspects, but change the title, call it something that they would be tempted to buy, like, for example, ancillary sewage treatment.
Well, I think the
minds a little bit, like they claim to be in favor of.
I think the intro I wrote would probably ignite someone's hair and fire in the first 4 pages if they didn't like heroism
that is a noble and
classical themes. Yep. But yeah, we're going to see if we can get that put together. Currently, it's Josh Young. I will love help if the rights want to go in there. They'll be able to help take us up a whole dimension on that.
I'd be happy to help on the project as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we should definitely have April look at it. I'm hoping right now, because I had a book come out yesterday, I've been kind of overwhelmed with things, but I'm hoping by next week to go in and take a look. I had one of these weeks where almost every day I was driving for 4 or 5 hours at a time. So
I'm also swamped, but I would like to help because several of the themes you're touching on are themes that are very near and dear to my heart. I just wrote a whole series about two groups of cleometers, two groups of psychohistorians fighting each other. Because one of the things that actually offended me about Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, and I mean the original trilogy, not the prequels that came later. Sorry, they were like the Star Wars prequels. They just weren't up to snuff. Was that Asimov's idea was that a small group of pointy-headed intellectuals, known as psychohistorians, would guide the entire galaxy through the Dark Ages to the Second Empire. And I just kept thinking, does no one get a vote in this system? the psychohistorian just gets to decide what's going to happen, whether there's going to be a war or a flood or a famine on your planet, and the broad scope of history is just going to be directed by them. And I thought, well, what would happen if there was one guy on the council, the second speaker of the planet Trantor, who just decided not to go along with the group? Now, it's not an idea original to me. There's a guy named Donaldson who wrote Psychohistorical Crisis. It was first a short story, and then it was expanded into a novel. It's well worth reading. He's the same author who wrote Courtship Right. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but he was a good author. He did
Gap series too, right?
Yes, he's a
Which
good
is
author.
the Ring of Nibelung.
No, that's a different.
He didn't. No. I'm thinking of.
Donald Kingsbury.
Donald Kingsbury. I'm sorry, I said the wrong name, and I even met Donald Kingsbury. And I like him, so I'm embarrassed.
Okay.
He's a fan of Van Doren and a fan of Jack Vance. Donald Kingsbury is an excellent writer and rarely remembered these days. And he didn't write that much, but what he wrote was really high quality. But I've gotten us off the theme. I had a question for Tom. In your thesis of the two extremes of superheroes and anti-heroes, with heroism falling in the middle, where would you put a classical work like the Iliad or the Odyssey? Because I noticed that Achilles has supernatural strength and warrior spirit, but he's in no sense a paragon.
Yeah, that's an interesting case, because I don't think that continuum really fits it, because that's what you're really talking about. There are myths, which are a different kind of story from anything that people are really doing nowadays. I mean, to the extent that Achilles is more than human, he's a mythical figure, and it was a well-established convention by Homer's time that when the gods start messing around with things, they're not required to abide by anybody's rules, including their own.
But I noticed he was a mythical tragic figure.
That's true.
Neither the superhero that you spoke of nor the anti-hero are tragic figures. For one thing, if an anti-hero comes to a bad end, we just smile. At least I do. I don't care. The main reason why I throw books across the room, the reason why I stop reading books, is because I don't care if any of the characters live or die.
Yeah.
Right? But in a superhero story where the hero is a simplistic hero, I like the convention that the hero's going to come in, he's going to solve the problem in some clever or brave way, and basically he's going to be reset so that by the next issue he solves another case. The reason why Sherlock Holmes doesn't change from story to story is because he's an episodic hero. He's got to be, everything's got to be reset for the next episode. The same thing for the Star Trek crew. By the time the Starship Enterprise is done with the adventure on whatever it's encountered that day, the things have to be the same the next day for the next episode. So you're not going to see character arcs on any of these type of shows from the nature of the genre.
Right. Which is why it's to be done in that way.
Correct. But that also has its roots in the Petty Dreadfuls, which were also episodic.
Yes, and that's, and as I say, it's if you are a hard leftist, then you are able to accept that kind of story only by assuming up front that everything done in that format is crap. I don't agree with that, in case I made that insufficiently clear. Sturgeon's law applies. 90% of it is crud. 90% of everything is crud.
Right. But I've read things written in the comic book format that were as good or better than things I've written in that I've seen, heard on radio plays, or seen on TV screens, or seen on movie screens, or read in bound books. So I
yes,
agree with you.
but at the same time, the good stuff being done in comics tends not to hew strictly to that reset to zero serial format. There do tend to be arcs in development.
I agree.
Because let's face it, after the 275th consecutive issue in which Lex Luthor gets away, just because they need to have a villain for next thrilling episode, the next episode starts to become less thrilling. It's usually when comic book readers realize that this is the game they're being played for, that they stop being readers and turn into collectors, which is a very pernicious thing to be.
Yeah, and you always wonder about why the Gotham City justice system is so friendly to all the insane villains infecting that city. They never seem to have a death penalty there, no matter what the guy does.
Yeah. The Joker has got 3,000 moving violations stuffed into his glove compartment, and he's never going to do it.
Joker would be right.
Well, they put them in Arkham. They just keep getting out. It's because Cthulhu's guys are also in Arkham, and it's just not a good place to put insane people. If they built a nice new prison that didn't have an evil, force in it, maybe they could keep their villains. But if they did, the
original 1960s Batman TV show, there was a running joke, and I wonder if I'm the only one who caught it, where the police chief and the Irish cop would always compliment the governor's progressive and enlightened legal process by having all the villains stuck in minimum security prisons, so they would get out by the next episode. And I always wondered if the guy was doing that on purpose. He was actually, making a snarky comment about how soft leftists are on crime.
Not impossible.
But of course, the problem goes the other way. You kill people off for drama, and then you lose the extra pull that you get when a character you already know comes back on stage. So then you go back and put some of those characters back so that you can use them again. Oh, look, he wasn't really dead. Because, of course, the characters, the readers want to see that.
But that's the value in an arch nemesis that never quite gets killed, but you just keep building it up over time.
If any of you all have ever read the Shadow novels written by the pulp novels written by Maxwell Grant, very rarely does the Shadow encounter the same villain twice. So I think he runs into his main nemesis, Shiwan Khan, only 3 times, because he, of course, blew people away with his guns. He eliminated them, but he lost some drama. There weren't recurring villains like in Batman or Superman, and the readers love the recurring villains because they build up a mythology after a while.
So similar with the Punisher, he doesn't have a lot of return villains. It's generally kind of rare.
Yeah, for the same reason.
Yep.
And
the Punisher sort of has return villains. I mean, there's the individuals go away, but the group survives.
I think there's one that's been out of the hospital like 3 times, like somehow survived like massive trauma. But
Jigsaw keeps turning up periodically, or used to.
And no one can kill off Fu Manchu, I'll point out.
Of course.
In fact, in the old movies, Christopher Lee would intone in his beautiful microphone voice, "The world shall hear from me again." So how does that tie back into either families or solving a problem with cleverness? Because there's no families in Fu Manchu except for his daughter, Fasa Lee.
Yep.
The bad guy has a family in that one.
The mad scientist has a beautiful daughter.
Doesn't that sound familiar?
I think I read that webcomic.
And I guess the only other element was the solving with cleverness versus heroism thing. And doctors Niven and Pornell, who write phenomenal science fiction, who got me into the love of science fiction with Neutron Star. And Neutron Star opens with Beowulf Schaefer succeeding in the entire thing through cleverness. He's not a bad man, but he outwits scientifically his foe, which is the tides of the neutron star, and he outwits his employers who are about to do him over
The puppeteers are blackmailing him.
But blackmailing them with legalism. And, it's not immoral what he does, but he doesn't do it through, sternness and stoicism and valor and compassion and all that. He triumphs with his mind, essentially, and his cunningness and willing to use it. And it's not an uncommon theme throughout those books. There are also, more traditional heroic types, I wouldn't say they're super conservative. They would have been about in the middle when they were at the height of their writing, but by today's standards, they would light someone's hair on fire. So,
yeah, I don't recall any acts of self-sacrificing heroism in Ringworld. It was mostly just a kind of a big puzzle in the sky that Louis Wu was encountering. I do seem to recall that the military is portrayed really sympathetically in Moten God's Eye, which was a collaboration between, and now my memory is fading. Was it Niven and Purnell wrote that?
Yeah, Doctors Niven and Purnell. It's
I think it's one of the best science fiction stories that there is. Now, what about Frank Herbert? What was his politics? Because Dune stars a family. The family connections are central to the plot of Dune. The Vladimir Harkonnen has an evil nephew. And
I have no idea.
Nor should anyone. Nor did I have any idea of any of the politics of any of my favorite authors when I was a kid.
Honestly,
which is part of that we live in a day and age when it comes out.
Part of it is the internet. Before the internet, if I liked an author, I would never see anything that author said or wrote except the book, unless the person was absurdly famous and appeared on like a talk show. But the fact that if a guy writes a blog, he's expecting to be read by a couple of fans or his family, and the guys who don't agree with him find it and then start reading it too, now we know a lot of information about each other that we didn't know before.
Well, there's two great science fiction authors I love. They're both Brits, Baxter and Hamilton. And they will write about political scenarios heavily, and they will show the good and the bad of like any situation's there, and it's well thought out. It's not just throwing cards out there, and the consequences are real, and they afflict the characters in real ways. And honestly, for the life of you, I couldn't tell you whether they go right or left, because they have good and bad things to say about a number of different scenarios. And I think that's honestly, it's kind of admirable, because they're taking a real intellectual approach at it, and all the characters are people, and all the scenarios that they're dealing with are people trying to make something work. And my favorite of anything has a downside to it, because this is Earth, not heaven. There's consequences for everything.
That's simply a sign of superior writing, because people who don't do that put up straw men and sock puppets. The sock puppet recites the author's point of view, and the straw man is the opponent. But a real author, a guy who's guided by his muse rather than by a propaganda impulse, tries to portray the enemy as sympathetically as possible. He's good, the reader is able to tell which side the author is on, even if the author is on any side. An author should love all his characters, including the villains.
Yeah.
There is a quote I came across recently, a professor having a student walk up to him, where the student says, "You're conservative, aren't you?" And the professor replies, I'm sorry that you could tell. I generally try to keep my politics out of the classroom. I try to keep everything fair and balanced and even." And the student smiles and says, "Yes, that's how I could tell."
Touche.
So I think that kind of sums up a lot of the differences between, reading conservative authors, quote unquote, or at least people who write conservative, because I'm sorry, for the most part, I go to a Joss Whedon product, I usually can't tell how much of a flaming leftist he is by the product.
He can portray a very conservative person like Captain Mao very sympathetically. and he'll have and arch conservatives will have posters on the wall saying, "If I shoot you, it'll be from the front," which is a conservative. That's the way conservatives shoot people, you know. For those of you who are going to take vengeance on it, when my daughter gets kidnapped, I just want you to be aware of that. Because his muse is stronger than his demon. Now, I think we should not. I'm going to disagree with the initial question that started this whole conversation at the beginning of the topic, which is, I don't think it's a difference between conservative and liberal at this point. Between the people for whom their politics is everything, and their politics eats away their brain until there's no brain cell unaffected by the politics, and B, the normal people. Now, of normal people, most of them are conservative, but there are some old school liberals who still manage to retain vaguely a grip on the notion that there's some things that are not part of their political scheme. But the modern liberals, the people that I call the Morlocks, the enemies of mankind, for them everything is political because what they call political is actually a religion that informs their entire worldview and affects every part of their life. They give themselves entirely over to political correctness the way a Christian gives himself entirely over to God. But even if it was conservative for whom politics was everything, he would just be a preacher, and his stories would be terrible because he would just preach. I know because I'm a guy like that.
There's a terribly chilling phrase that I encountered in Martin Amos's Koba the Dread, which was a book about Joseph Stalin, and where one of the things that Stalin's functionaries used to brag about was that they wanted to politicize everything, and the phrase was the politicization of sleep. They even wanted sleep to be an ideological act, and there was a very good example of this in the book because there was a dissident who escaped from, I think, Czechoslovakia when it was behind the Iron Curtain, settled in London, and for the rest of his life he could not sleep at night. He could not fall asleep until dawn because when he saw the light at the window, he knew in his bones that the secret police were not coming that night to take him away.
It's funny that one of the joke that I heard, years ago when there was still an Iron Curtain that always kind of both saddened and amused me was about how British and Russian people do things differently. And it said, well, there was a hotel room and there was a British businessman and a Russian businessman, and they both one took his pants off one leg at a time, the other just dropped his pants. One pulled back the sheets, and one climbed into the sheets without pulling them back. And in the middle of the night, when someone knocked on the door, the British gentleman got up and opened the door, and the Russian gentleman jumped out the window. And I saw a corollary that was even sadder recently, which was it was supposed to be a conversation between Putin and the head of North Korea. And so the head of Russia asked a Russian soldier to jump off a cliff to show how obedient the Russians are, and the Russian soldier says, "Sir, I have a wife and children," and he says, "Never mind. I just, it's good enough that you were willing to do it." And then the North Korean gentleman asks North Korean to jump off the cliff, and the guy goes to do it, and the head of Russia says, "It's okay, you don't have to do it," and the North Korean says, "Sir, I have a wife and kids."
Right.
Even sadder. But the idea of that, waiting for the light, the idea that their life is so much more horrible than anything we have to deal with. And that, of course, is what books like 1984 and Brave New World and things like that were supposed to be about. And they were supposed to be something that we were not going to actually have to see, that we were merely, being warned against. And nowadays it kind of looks like we're a lot closer to those things than we used to be.
Having just read those books, I can totally agree with that.
You have to remember that the one thing that was genuinely fictional about 1984 was that it was set in England. Time and again, as I have read, the normal reaction of people living behind the Iron Curtain when they got a hold of a samizdat copy of 1984 and read it, they always had the same reaction. How did he know
what it was like? Yeah.
Well, the sad thing was that in his day and age, it was not actually that hard to find out what things were like behind the Iron Curtain. It's not like those who were interested in discovering it could not discover it.
The book on that,
despite Walter Duranty's best efforts, everyone in the West who wanted to know knew there was a famine in the Ukraine, for example. Everyone in the West who wanted to know knew how many even civilians were being killed by the Chekhov every day.
But anybody, here's the problem with saying wanted to know. Anybody who does trust the newspapers because they think the newspapers are supposed to be bringing them news, and they haven't seen them report anything they know wrong, I think it's not quite fair to say that they didn't want to know. If you were a person who read every article on the subject that was put out in all the papers you got, how much additional effort would you have to do to find out this additional stuff? A lot of the things we know now, they didn't know at the time. My dad said that when he was a soldier in World War II, he was before he joined the Life magazine guys, and wrote for Home Front. He was in a tank unit. He said they didn't know about the Holocaust. They had no idea the Jews were being killed. They just thought this was about like England not liking Germany and stuff.
But
and all that came out later.
But the New York Times did know about the Holocaust and decided not to report on it.
But saying that anybody who could find out could, I mean, the New York Times might have known, but how does a guy in America who's not in Russia find out that there's a famine?
We do
How would he
have
find it out?
a broader scope of knowledge available to people today than was available to the average person then, which makes...
But I'm sorry, but there were articles written and books written on the topic, and it was not unknown.
My favorite book on that topic is We the Living by Ayn Rand, because she does such a good job of showing how the society fell apart, and it was basically something a lot like our modern way of things going. The scene that really stuck with me all these years was the main character was already working, like way overtime, and she was told that she was gonna assigned to go volunteer at the library. And as things were falling apart, altruism was the thing that they were all being all sly about. If you were not altruistic, then you would be arrested. And you had to be altruistic and volunteer all your time. And they put her in a situation where she there was impossible to do all the things that they wanted to be done. And the freedom was falling apart. Now, the sad difference in America is the freedom was falling apart, but there were guns behind it. In a lot of the stuff we've seen with the extremists in America nowadays, we're just cutting away at our own freedom with no guns behind it. We're just putting the shackles on our own arms.
That's the thing that's amazing to me about 1984 and about Orwellian newspeak taking over our nation, is that in 1984 they were under the thumb of a totalitarian dictatorship that was trampling them eternally. But nowadays in modern America, the leftists volunteer to have their speech and thought policed.
Are you sure that's true?
They're all volunteer thought police officers.
I don't think that's true. I mean, on a strict level.
Point me to the statute or law that forbids a certain type of speech.
No. Hang on. I understand that. On a strictly literal,
formally, it's all done without legal coercion. That's what I mean.
Well, okay. I'm just saying, strictly, I agree with you. Nobody's putting a gun to their head, but at the same time, the sort of leftists that are going along with this sort of thing and embracing it, maybe we just don't think like them, but they're very concerned about being part of the in-group, and the idea of being sort of read out and sort of ostracized and thrown out is terrifying to them.
But a lot of them think that they're not, I mean, they might want to be part of the in-group, but they think they're rebels.
But being snubbed is not the same. Being snubbed is not the same as being shot in the head. That's my whole point. In
it's true. It's not as bad.
In the Soviet Union, you would be shot if you spoke out of turn. These guys are doing it voluntarily.
Disturbingly, I suspect a lot of them want to do it.
The group is doing it voluntarily if you like, but there's no enforcement.
I think it's a little bit more like Animal Farm than it is like 1984, because in Animal Farm, all the animals were in it together at first, but then some animals became more equal than other animals. But it happened kind of slowly, you know.
And I'll point out there's no families either in 1984 or in Brave New World or in Animal Farm.
Nope.
To tie it back into the original topic.
Yep.
That's intentional, though, isn't it? I mean, like, there's no family in Brave New World, and that's sort of the point.
Yes.
The whole warning
is the point.
Look, this is where these lunatics are taking us.
Yeah.
Yes, and in 1984, the family still exists as a matter of biological necessity, but the only family attachment anybody is supposed to have is to Big Brother.
Correct.
He was called that for a very conscious reason.
Right. Because we know that all these natural affections exist, but the modern effort is, and I'm always reminded of That Hideous Strength when I think of these things. The horrible bad guys in that seem to me to fit these kind of things exactly. But the modern effort is to misdirect it, right? To put it all in the wrong place.
I really need to read that at some point.
Where Merlin the Magician is told by a modern man that they have an engine called the press, which is used to deceive the people.
Yes. I'll give you the secret in one sentence to reading That Hideous Strength. It's not a sequel to the other Lewis planetary romances. It is a sequel to everything that Lewis ever wrote.
Most significantly, it's the novelization of The Abolition of Man.
Yes.
It's one of my favorite things that he wrote. I really think he really caught quite a bit in that book. John ran a role-playing game in that background once, and the bad guys in that are the NICE, which I think is actually the real name. There's a real British organization called the NICE.
Yeah, there is.
In the game, they were, doing various bad things, and it came to the scene where a NPC came running up to one of the players, crying out, "The nice people are destroying my house!"
But the joke there is Lewis's. He's the one who depicted it.
Yes. But you made it even funnier. But I really like that book. I think there was a lot that kind of could jump off of that.
No, that book creeped me out. I mean, it's a good book.
But it's creepy because it's so on the mark.
Oh, yeah.
It's creepy because it's happening. It's coming true around us now. We're being invaded by the macrobes. The Frost and Wither, their philosophies is now the dominant philosophy of the nation in which I live. Most people I debate with online are either creatures like Frost, who claim to have no free will and are just being meat robots, or creatures like Wither, who claim that nothing really means anything, and that we each create our own reality. You can't judge another man because you can't judge another man because we each make our own reality. We're all little demigods in our own little insane asylums inside our own skulls.
Yes, of course. In practice, what this means is I create my own reality, and nobody can judge me. But you're an evil reactionary bigot.
Yeah, that's another thing that bothers me. Oh gosh.
Honestly, there's a common theme with all of it. The common theme with all of that and the no agency is the escape from responsibility. If there's no agency, you can't be held responsible for anything.
Right, you're not a sinner if it's not your fault.
It was, and the whole victim thing. I was thinking just today about possibly writing an article. I keep wanting to try to put into words why the difference between saying that if a young woman is walking down the middle of a normal street in the middle of the day in a normal way and she gets raped, we shouldn't blame the victim, and saying this means that women should be able to wear skimpy clothes, go to bars, get drunk, rub their bodies up against guys, and then say, don't blame the victim, if they get date raped after they invited a guy into their house.
It is insane, isn't it?
And why one of those has a quality of negligence involved. You know, I was thinking if I write the article, I was just going to give some other examples of, things that are accidental and not the victim's fault versus things where, like, to give you an example, if you walk out onto your porch and it suddenly collapses, it's not your fault. If If you walk out on your porch for every day for a year and it shakes and you think, I'm going to fix it later, and then it collapses, there's an aspect of negligence in there, even if, we're not going to say you were sinful for falling off the porch.
But a lawyer would say you were negligent.
Right. And I think the idea because the idea behind the second one, where you're going to the bar, you're wearing skimpy clothes, you're getting drunk, you're inviting a guy in, is I don't want to behave morally and chastely. I want human nature to change. I want to make it so that men are not interested in looking at attractive girls. And that's not going to happen. We don't have the capacity to do that.
If you remember your 1984, there was an anti-orgasm league that was promoted just for some of that purpose to destroy the notions of love and romance. I'll point out, however, Josh, that there's one huge exception to the rule about women not getting raped and not blaming the victim. If you're living in England or Germany and your political leaders have invited in thousands of barbarians from a country where raping women is commonplace, you are then instructed not to dress provocatively when you go down the street.
It was quite shocking when Sweden said,
and they reversed it on
our girls dress wrong.
And they reversed on a dime without even the slightest hint of shame at their absolute outrageous hypocrisy. The leftists in Europe, they just said, no, we're wrong. It's the woman's fault.
Judgy,
guys.
One observation I heard about. I actually don't think it's the women the women that are behaving the way you were suggesting necessarily want human nature to change. What it seems they want, which I thought was an interesting observation by Dalrock, I think, from memory. What they want is they want all the danger of going out and going to bed with strangers and how that's exciting and quite dangerous, really, like almost suicidally dangerous. But
Yes.
they want that. So they want that. They want they basically want all of the danger and all of the excitement of that, but they want it to be safe, like a roller coaster.
Yeah, it's not safe.
It's a lunatic request, and it's actually
there's
impossible.
another side to it,
But that's
too,
what I
I might add. When you hear stories of things like girls on campuses who go and say, hey, I'm going to go have sex, and then they go have sex, and then they accuse the guy of rape, part of what's going on is that modern girls are not even being told. By nature, females don't actually do well sleeping around. We're actually happier with one partner. And other things like this. So they're not being told, if you go have sex with the wrong guy, you're going to feel really bad afterwards. So when they feel really bad afterwards, they blame the guy.
But also
The guy doesn't know any different from how they feel one way or the other.
As a faithful Catholic, I have to point out they're also not told that getting on the pill messes up your hormones and makes you freaky and makes you attracted to the wrong kind of guys.
All I know,
as Milo said, the pill makes women ugly and crazy.
Yeah.
Well,
and when the women get crazy, the men get weak, and when the men get weak, the women get crazy.
all I can say for sure is this was not a phenomenon when I was in college. It wasn't a phenomenon when the other people that I know were in college. There's something that has changed.
Yeah.
And
I agree. It's definitely
the theory that's being promoted is that it's always been that way. Doesn't
it was never like that. I mean, when I was in college, it wasn't like that at all.
So
this idea that
I don't
when
know
I was
who
young,
or what is
people
happening,
were in favor.
but something's changed.
People were in favor of allowing people to act in a promiscuity, unchaste way, but they were completely and utterly aware that the rest of society thought that you shouldn't do that. Nowadays, they're acting like they're supposed to be able to do that, and as if they're not even aware that there's another version.
Well,
Exactly.
and you had loose stuff, but you didn't have all of this violence that was going on. You didn't have the rapes. You didn't have any of this stuff. You didn't have the allegations of it. It wasn't like that. You would have bad relationships and disasters, but you wouldn't have this.
Yeah,
I
but they
think
also
about-
expanded the definitions of what it means to be sexually assaulted. It's more or less anytime a man looks at you wrong, you're assaulted, or you can say you're assaulted. So that expands the whole statistic of 1 in 4 women get
that came
raped,
up.
which is
I
ridiculous.
hate to bring up politics, but that came. I noticed that nobody is pointing out that the current presidential candidate is not saying he assaulted women. He's saying women wanted him. Those are not the same things at all, you know. But nowadays, if you don't have a signed affidavit, it must have been assault, you know.
But that's also going back to whether or not a woman has agency, and it's whether or not it fits the narrative of the day. They either do or they don't.
You make a good point. Because if the woman doesn't have agency, not only is she the victim no matter what she does, but she's also not responsible no matter what she does. So she can both do whatever she wants and escape responsibility and claim to be the victim even when she's not because she has no agency.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Two quick
On
things.
that subject, I keep having the thought that the left is immorality and sinfulness, and yet they're surprised when evil comes from it.
Yeah.
Well, to tie it back into our original topic again, I noticed that someone once asked me, John, where would someone of this generation see any normal, intact families or see any examples of chastity being the winning strategy for dealing with the opposite sex?
I think I have to.
Would they see any examples of that? On what
Jewel and Bethany are good examples.
Would they show that?
What did you say, April?
Oh, I'm just pointing out that my brother and his fiance are good examples of this because they've been together for about 6 years, and Bethany made a promise to herself a long time ago that she would not kiss until she was married. And their relationship is one of the best relationships I've ever observed.
I think there's...
But they need their own TV show, otherwise people aren't going to see it.
I think there's plenty of conservative Christian real couples and families, but our question was if you were learning from the media and the books, nowadays when I was a kid, it was clear that anybody who strayed outside of marriage was thought to be in the wrong, even if there were people who didn't agree with that point of view. Nowadays, there are people who nobody's even telling them that point of view. If their family, if their church is not telling them that point of view, where would they be getting it? It's not in all the TV shows. It's not in all the books. Where would they even see it?
Oh, yeah, you make a good point. Also, Bethany and Jewel are probably going to kill me for mentioning them.
Anyway.
Well, we admire them very much.
So,
hey, Declan, were you going to say something?
We only have 4 listeners on this podcast anyway, so they're never going to hear.
But one of them is Jeffro. He's cool.
I think it's I think it's about time to wrap up. I'm going to have to take off.
Declan was starting to say something. Declan, did
please.
Yes.
No, that was like two topics ago now.
So. Go ahead. Say it.
Well, on the one hand, I came across an article from my Facebook memories from a year ago today, an article where California, because only in California, where new law either suggested or passed, and since it's California, I'm going to say passed, a woman in the middle of coitus must continue to consent every 10 minutes.
Yeah.
In the middle of the act, which is like, hold on, do you need a signed affidavit? Do you need a timer? Do you need to stop every 10 minutes?
She's got to say yes in a low, moaning voice. That's very sensual.
There's a joke in here about the guy's only lasting
so you have to stop.
I think you're also not allowed to record it either.
Probably not.
People suggested that you could just record it, but then...
Why don't we have the consent be given in an open public ceremony with the woman
like
in a veil and like throwing flowers and have them vow it before God and the whole congregation so that there's absolutely no ambiguity as to which couple is allowed to legally have coitus and which couples are not. What about that? We could call it wedlock marriage or something. I realize as a science fiction writer, it's my job to make up these bizarre new ideas that no one's ever heard of before.
Oh dear. Yes.
Yeah. Well,
I also have another thought going back to the very first subject of the difference between the liberal and conservative. And my thought is that the conservatives don't always have to use their political views in their stories, whereas the liberals, like almost always, but conservatives, I think, see the beauty. Well, conservatives and people that aren't the alt-left. So the non-Morlock.
Yeah, the liberals have to give you lecture.
Yeah, but the normal people that actually love sci-fi can see the beauty of our genre in that we can be able to explore all kinds of political philosophies, even just general philosophies, even ones we don't believe with, explore. I think that's the difference between the liberals and conservatives, in that the conservatives can don't feel trapped by their own philosophy.
It's a lot like the story that was told earlier about the professor who didn't put his politics in his class.
Yeah,
it also reminds
exactly
me
what makes me think of that.
when John was a atheist. He has a half-finished manuscript that had like 5 or 6 different main characters, and one was a Christian and one was a Buddhist. And I was really struck at the time because his Christian character and his Buddhist character were just as beautifully portrayed as his atheist character. And that's the thing that we often, that we're missing some of the time.
Yeah, I'll point out that it's not all liberals, though. It depends on what the liberalism has eaten
I
their
think it's
brain,
very important because there are many liberals out there who have...
Joss Whedon writes perfectly good story. He writes stories where Captain America says, you know, God's don't dress in spandex. And all the conservatives stood up and cheered at that character. Red, white, and blue American. I mean, he can portray it.
I agree. I think that it's a...
But here's my question: how come the second-rate writers who are liberals use their liberalism as a crutch, and they turn their stories into these boring lectures?
You know that
I think it's the Gatekeepers. Was it Declan was talking about earlier, or maybe it was David?
When I was a kid, John, the first time I ran into this, it was Christian. The Christian books I read that when I was a kid almost pushed me off being a Christian. They were so obnoxiously boring and preachy. So it's not, that's why I keep saying extremists. It's not really liberal versus conservative. It's story first versus extreme message first.
Do you agree with me that it was religion versus people whose religion is not everything in them? Because guys who have to preach no matter what the topic is are different from guys who some topics they preach on and some they are outside that orbit.
I don't know what the quality is, but I think it's probably demons.
I'm not saying it's demons, but it's demons.
I think there's a darkness.
We need to start a new meme.
Extremism, and if we don't mean demons in the sense of a guy with bat wings, demons in the sense of a kind of a darkness that eats at you, kind of thing you would have seen in.
I actually believe in fallen angels, and
right, but I'm just saying when I say it's demons, I mean it. I mean even from a kind of secular point of view. Yeah. I mean a negative kind of a. There's that little video I've talked about before where anger that shows how the memes of anger spread.
The seculars use psychiatry as their
and you could put it other way. But
they have this made up myth by a guy named Freud where they're trying to explain the phenomenon with kind of a
honestly demons model. Makes more sense.
Well, of course
I have a definition of demon that I like to use with secular people. A demon, I tell them, is the spirit of a bad idea.
That's very well put, because I think even with non-secular people, a demon really is the spirit of a bad idea, even if we might clothe it in an image of bat horns or goat horns and bat wings.
I like to think of bent
but it really is a bad idea.
Yeah, it's a bad spirit. It's an obsession.
But even people who don't believe in spirits as such can get how you can be possessed by a bad ideology.
I mean, you can point to something like, the communists or the Nazis and say, look how this bad idea spread.
Yes.
Yep. All righty. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yes, we need to wrap it up. We're going to run away.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hey, Jason, is it okay if I mention that my first Rachel Griffin book is free until Monday?
Of course. Should have mentioned that.
Go out, download it, give it to someone as a gift. Thank you.
If you don't, I'll find you.
And Tom, you already have a sale of your first customer when your next book of essays comes out.
Thank you.
Yeah, John is. I told him that when we were in Chincoteague, you were sitting there looking glum and saying what you really wanted to read was more Tom Simon essays.
Yeah.
They're good.
So Tom, you got to step it up. Get unhealthy less often, please, and
Write more essays.
Yeah. Look, people say it to me, I can say it to other people. Okay.
All right, everyone. I'm going to wrap the chat up there. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, Jason, for hosting.
Thank you.
We'll talk to our listeners next time.